welcome in. Welcome back to another episode of the Format Podcast. Got a really interesting show for you here today. Kevin Durant, man, he said something crazy, but we'll get to that in just a couple minutes. But before we do, you know what time it is. If you haven't already, please go ahead, click that subscribe, that notification bell, and that like button here on YouTube. And make sure that you get kept up to date on when new episodes of the show are coming out so you can stay up with this content we're bringing you. If you want the audio only version of the podcast, open up your audio podcast platform, hit the search bar, type in the Format Podcast. We should come up. If you enjoy the content, please make sure you give us that 5-star review, like it, however you can tell your podcast platform you're enjoying it, just do that. If you make sure that you share the pod with other people who love sports talk as much as you do, I'd really appreciate it. And make sure you do those things. Helps us rise in the algorithm, helps us find more sports fans, helps more sports fans find us. All right, let's get right to it. So where do I start? I think that everybody is kind of beholden to their own generation, no matter what it is, right? Whether it's music, whether it's sports, whether it's style of dress, whatever it is, right? I know that when I was coming up, my parents used to look at me like, what are you doing, right? The baggy clothes, the hoodies and the Timbs and the baggy jeans and all that. When they were coming up in the 60s and 70s, that wasn't the thing. So they looking at us like, why are you wearing clothes that don't fit? Like, what's the deal with that? You look like a hoodlum, whatever. Now, our kids, if you have kids and if you're my age, our kids dress differently than we did. So now I'm looking at them like, this is all weird, right? When I was coming up, and I was really into hip hop music, my mom would be like, what is this you're listening to, right? Because they grew up on Motown and whatever else, or whatever the local music was, wherever they were from. But the point is, each generation has different things that they're beholden to. And I remember I was talking to a friend one time in the barbershop, and we were talking about hip hop music. And I was like, man, I can't even understand this stuff that, these young cats are listening to now when it comes to hip hop. And he just looked at me and said, you're not supposed to, it's not for you. So I get it. We're all beholden on some levels to our own generations, and that transcends everything. But in this particular situation, we're going to talk about it as it regards to sports, most specifically the NBA, right? So, I'm beholden to my generation. I'm sure the generation before me is beholden to theirs, right? So I'm right on the cusp of Magic and Bird going over into Jordan and Olajuwon, and then Shaq and Kobe, and of course now LeBron James. But for me, that sweet spot is probably about 86 to 2006. That 20-year stretch, I think, in my estimation, is probably the best stretch in NBA history. If you ask some cats older than me, they'll probably say that time with Wilt and Oscar and Jerry West and Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, young Kareem by that point. But they'll probably say that's the best stretch. And if you ask cats younger than me, they're going to say, well, this is clearly the best stretch. You're LeBron and you're Kobe. I guess they would say later Kobe, but definitely you're LeBron and you're Kawhi Leonard and you're, whoever else today, right? So we're all beholden to our eras to some degree, Kevin Durant. So as I talk about that, here's where we get into the meat of this topic today. Kevin Durant recently was on his own podcast, and he said something that I thought was, I'm going to be real here, totally asinine, right? Now, Kevin Durant is one of the better players of all time. He has a tremendous offensive toolkit. Nobody's going to denigrate him, what he's been able to do in this game. He's just an incredible player offensively. And unlike a lot of great offensive players today, he has been willing to play defense. Now, nobody's going to say he's Scottie Pippen or Gary Payton in terms of he's going to completely lock somebody down, but he has been a willing defender and above average defender, right? So cool. Kudos for that. Now, Kevin Durant, I also think is a student of the game, right? He studies the greats that came before him because he wants to be able to add things to his offensive toolkit, right? Okay, cool. So here's where I kind of get lost when it comes to Kevin Durant. So Kevin Durant made a statement saying that the 80s and 90s brand of NBA basketball wasn't any more physical than it is today. Yes, you heard me correctly. All right, I'm going to go ahead. I'm going to play the sound for you. You can check it out. Then we're going to come back and talk about it. Here we go.
I go back and watch a lot of that 90s film, 80s stuff, and they play physical, but I just think they got away with a lot of flagrant fouls, and I think that's why they call their era more physical than ours, because we play physical here too. It's more space, but guys play physical. We got strong, athletic guys here too. But I watched some of those games. The paint was clear. Nobody was getting touched. It wasn't a lot of help defense. But you did get a lot of flagrant fouls that didn't result into fines or getting kicked out the game. So it just seemed like, it was a little tougher.
Cocaine is a hell of a drug.
So KD, this is what I gotta ask. What are you thinking? And not even just what are you thinking? What are you watching? Because you're sitting here and you're telling me that you're watching the games from the past and it's not as physical as it is today. You're sitting here telling me that you're watching a game from the past and the paint was open and there's not a lot of help defense. Like, what are you watching? I grew up on this stuff. Now, granted, I am not, never have been anywhere near the galaxy of a player you are when it comes to basketball, all right? We all did some hooping. We all had hoop dreams. I was never anything close to what you possess talent-wise in your little finger. I can admit that wholeheartedly. But I do know what I saw. I do know what I came up watching. And matter of fact, I'm exactly 10 years to the day older than Kevin Durant. So I have a little more time in watching NBA basketball than he does, right? So anyway, I say all this to say, what are you watching? Kevin Durant says, well, first, he contradicts himself when he talks about how there were more flagrant fouls back then that weren't being called. That right there should tell you the game was more physical, right? We also know that when we listen to any player that played back in the day, they talk about the rules about not coming in the paint. And we hear Shaq talking all the time about touching guys up when they come in the paint. We hear Isaiah Thomas talking about the abuse that he took going into the paint. Even later, we see Allen Iverson constantly hitting the floor, going into the paint. We see Michael Jordan constantly hitting the floor, going into the paint, even as mercurial as he was as an offensive player. Back then, it was well known that you traveled into the paint at your own risk, right? And so I just don't understand what you're watching, because Kevin Durant, you're saying that the game was now more physical, but clearly it was. I mean, we saw bigs, true bigs, really banging in the paint. Why do we think that the lifespan of players in the NBA was so much shorter back in the day? Why do we think that Stu Jackson, as vice president of player operations, talked about the freedom of movement and taking the physicality out of the game? That's literally what he said. That's not my opinion. He literally discussed, and this is in the early to mid 2000s, taking the physicality out of the game, introducing freedom of movement, making it more difficult to guard perimeter players and making it easier to score. Adam Silver in 2018 talking about how the rules changes have had the desired effect on the NBA. Like, we all know this. It's all there. Like, I don't understand what you're watching. First of all, you mentioned the flagrant foul, Kevin Durant. In 1990-91, that season was the first season that the flagrant foul was actually introduced. Prior to that, there was no flagrant foul. So if you're talking in the 80s, how could it not be more physical when there were no flagrant fouls? It was just a two-shot foul in the ball, right? Nowadays, you cannot hand check, you cannot forearm check. Anything remotely physical, you're probably getting tossed out of the game. You can't breathe on guys. Kevin Durant, like, what are you really talking about when you talk about the game today is as physical as it was back then? Let me give you a perfect example, KD. And maybe you personally are suffering from some memory loss. Again, as great as a player as you are. Last year in the playoffs, when you played against the Boston Celtics, you had the worst playoff series of your career. Why did you have the worst playoff series of your career? Because the Celtics got physical with you. They got physical with you. They put just a piece of the physicality that everybody had to deal with back in the day on you, and you had one of the worst series of your career, if not the worst, right? We saw the double teams and the traps coming from everywhere to make it tougher on you to get to your spots and get a good shot off. We saw that we saw them really consistently taking the ball out of your hands by trapping and double teaming from odd angles that you weren't used to. We saw them bumping you, getting physical everywhere, and you didn't know how to deal with it. Now, if you had come up in that era, I guarantee you would have adjusted. But I also guarantee you probably wouldn't at 7 feet be the perimeter player that you are today. Why is that? Because the game is more physical. They would have tried to work on bulking you up and sticking you on the block. And maybe that's trying to put a square peg into a round hole. So be it. But at any rate, the point I'm trying to make is for you to say that the game is not more physical back then than it is today, that's just absolutely asinine. You're playing a game where, let's say I'm the shooting guard, right? and I get into the paint. I beat my man, right? So there's 2 power forwards there, 1 from each team. There's likely 2 centers there, 1 from each team, right? Maybe if some help defense comes, you have the small forward there, because at 7 feet, you need another person with some size and length to try and disrupt you a little bit, right? Or even maybe it's another little guard, a point guard, to try and swipe the ball when you put it down to get into the paint. Cool. So what does that mean? Counting yourself, there's likely 6 players in the paint at any given time on penetration, right? And are you telling me in a small confined area such as the paint, and you've got 6 players, right? And back then, bigs were big, right? Legitimate 240, 250 pound, 6'10 power forwards, 7 foot, 240, 250 pound, maybe 260 pound, depending on the player. Centers, right? 220 pound, 6'7", 6'8 small forwards, right? So all this is in the paint. You don't think that they are banging and fighting for position? Is that not physicality? I'm not just talking about the flagrant fouls and the hacking people. I'm talking about just the banging. Just the banging. That's not physicality. You don't see that anymore in today's game. I can't believe that you could say that you're watching 80s and 90s basketball and it's not as physical. I mean, just the mere fact that you have so many big bodies confined in such a small space means the game is going to be more physical. KD, man, I love you as a player. I think you're smooth. I think you have one of the best offensive toolkits of all time, but I don't know what you're watching. And besides that, just based on what you personally experienced last year as a player, having your worst playoff season ever statistically, because you faced some physicality, the mere fact that you could say it's as physical today as it was back then is totally beyond me. So what I want to know from you is Kevin Durant out of his mind? Do you think the game today is as physical as it was in yesteryear? Go ahead, leave me a comment in the comment section. Look forward to hearing them. Look forward to responding. And I'm out. Peace.